Micro Hunter log, day 21. I've discovered a shiny metal object. It seems pixelated, almost too pixelated. One might even say a pixel tube. Oh no, that triggered something. It's unstable. Quick, I need to teleport this back to Earth by saying the code word. Zoom!
What up, Monto Tech here, and I found this weird box on my desk today. And if you clicked on this video, then you know that this is the GKD Pixel 2, short for
Game Kiddy Pixel 2.
I don't know what it is with Game Kiddy and Pow Kitty, but I'm giddy to check this handheld out. Now, what is the GKD Pixel 2? It's the successor to the semi-successful GKD Pixel 1, a micro-sized handheld in an aluminum body with a 2.4-inch display. The Pixel 2 improves on the original in every single way. It has double the resolution, a more powerful processor, bigger battery, and it's actually available to buy. The Pixel 1 is practically a collector's item at this point, ever since it sold out last year. And lately, I've been on the hunt for the perfect micro-sized handheld. Something that I can keep in my pocket next to my phone and earbuds, and ideally forget that it's even there. For the past few months, the Anbernic RG Nano has actually been my micro-handheld of choice, but it's very limiting in terms of both performance and ergonomics. Now, our latest challenger, the GKD Pixel 2, has a much more powerful chipset that can play up through Nintendo DS with a few PSP, N64, and Dreamcast games, all inside of a pocket-sized metal body. So in this video, we're gonna dive deep into the Pixel 2, see how it feels, play some different games on it, and decide if this is the best micro handheld money can buy right now, or if we should just hold off and wait for something better. So let's dive deep into the GKD Pixel 2. So, you've been staring at this cardboard box for a solid few minutes at this point. Let's crack it open and see what's going on inside. How do you do this again? I think I got it. Oh, I can see it. I can see it. Yep. Go. Now, we don't want to damage the contents, so I'm gonna unbox this delicately using a pair of scissors. Very gently, just like that. And here is the box for the Game Kiddy Pixel 2. I love this box. Off the rip, this thing is beautiful and it has a great texture to it. It actually feels very premium. Shouts out to Game Kiddy. Please change your name. On top of the handheld, we have this quick start guide. What should I do when the game machine breaks down? I hope that's a mistranslation because gosh, I hope that this doesn't break down like a fucking semi-truck. Is this thing gonna like pulverize when I grab it? So yeah, that's the quick start guide. This is actually like the first semi-helpful quick start guide I've ever really seen in one of these handhelds. Except for the fact that it tells you in the brightness adjustment to hold down menu and click the volume up and down. But that doesn't work. You have to hold select and use the volume up and down buttons, not the menu button, in order to change brightness. Took me way too long to figure that one out. Wow. All right, well, first off, it already has a TF card in it. What's going on in here? Whoa!
This ain't your mama's SD card. This is a Game Kiddy original. You're looking at a Game Kiddy 64GB A1 micro SD card.
It's actually less helpful than if it were just like if I knew it was a Kioxia. If I don't know what brand SD card it is, I wouldn't trust it. Maybe just use your own SD card. But here we have the GKD Pixel 2. Now the website says that the GKD Pixel 2 is 62mm long, 81mm tall, and 17mm thick. Let's convert that to freedom units. The Pixel 2 is exactly 2.5 inches wide, slightly over 3 inches tall, and a little over ½ an inch thick. All right, now let's do some size comparisons of the GKD Pixel and how it stacks up to some devices that you're more familiar with. Here's an Anbernic RG Nano. It's kind of the quintessential micro handheld that is pretty much the most portable thing you can really find. that's actually functional outside of like the Funky S and those really tiny ones. Both the Pixel and the RG Nano both have this metal housing, but the Nano is pretty much like half the size of the Pixel 2. If you kind of go by surface area, the Nano is about like 60% the width of the Pixel 2. The Pixel 2 is noticeably thicker than the RG Nano. Now on the upper end of micro handhelds, here's the Miyoo Mini V4. This isn't the Plus. The Miyoo Mini is about 20% taller than the Pixel 2, but surprisingly enough, the Miyoo Mini is only about 1 millimeter wider than the Pixel 2. The Pixel 2 is very wide. Here's how it compares to the TrimUI brick. The brick is clearly a bit wider than the Pixel 2. Now thickness is very similar, but the TrimUI brick still takes this. And here's how it stacks up to an Anbernic SP. You can see the Pixel 2 only gets up to about the hinge of the SP. And here's our community voted king of retro handhelds, the Retroid Pocket 5. The Pixel 2 is just about as tall as the Retroid Pocket 5, and it's also about 1/3 the length of the Pocket 5. Make way, shrimp! Compared to a Steam Deck, it's close. And here's how the Pixel 2 compares to my favorite Xbox controller. I skin swapped it myself. It's about as wide and as tall as the middle part of the controller. Here's the Pixel 2 next to an iPhone 13 Pro. It'll look like that in your pocket. It might give you a bit of a bulge though, because it's about twice as thick as the iPhone. And here's a pair of beat up AirPod Pro 2s. The AirPods are about 40% the height of the Pixel 2, and the Pixel is about 10% wider than the AirPods. More or less same thickness too. Now this handheld is also on the heavier side. It weighs exactly 200 grams, so it feels very sturdy and dense. And it feels very solid at this weight. Anymore and it could be a little fatiguing, but it strikes a great balance here. Now the Pixel 2 is what I'd consider a big, tiny handheld. It's large for a small handheld. Other handhelds are either vertically long or horizontally long. The GKD Pixel 2 is neither. It's more square, which is actually nice because you kind of get the benefits of both at the cost of feeling pretty boxy, especially in your pocket. Visually, the shape is definitely a love it or hate it feature. We can see here with the RG Nano, there's some rounded elements like this corner down here, the back, that give it some contrast. The Pixel 2, on the other hand, is just a brick of a device. Not necessarily good or bad, it all really depends on what you're interested in. The brushed metal housing feels very premium to the touch. The handheld has a good weight to it, and it generally feels like a premium experience playing these games. Even if they don't perform perfectly, the overall gaming experience just feels more premium because of this build. The handheld kind of gives off a Game Boy Micro vibe with the metal body and blend of premium feeling, small form factor, and the very crisp display. Let's talk about the different color options that you can get with the GKD Pixel 2. The Pixel 2 comes in 4 colorways: gray, purple, red, and green, like you're seeing here. They all have this brushed metal finish to them, which you might like or you might dislike. I feel like this finish is quite polarizing compared to something that's a little less of a clearly brushed metal finish. You can see side by side here with the Anbernic, they both have a metal finish, but the Pixel has a lot more of that kind of speckled reflective finish, while the Anbernic is more of a standard color. And this brushed metal speckly finish is consistent throughout all the different colors. You're not gonna really get away from that. If you like it, you're gonna love it. If you don't like it, you're probably not gonna really be interested in any of the colors, to be honest. Like the darkest you're gonna get is that gunmetal gray. Now I pre-ordered this with my own money so that we could get a review in sooner, but our friends over at Lit NXT are actually sending me a purple one. So we'll take a look at both those colors when that arrives. Now let's talk about the features of the GKD Pixel 2. On the front, we have a 2.4-inch IPS OCA laminated display with a resolution of 640 by 480 and a pixels per inch of 333, which is well above average, so it should look pretty sharp at this size. It has a D-pad, start and select buttons, and ABXY buttons in the Nintendo layout. A on the right, X on the top. On the right side, we have a menu button, power button, and a very unique 4-bar power status display to show you how much charge you have left in your battery. On the back, we have the Pixel logo, texture for grip, and at the bottom left, what seems to be a stealthy lanyard slot. On the left side, we have a volume rocker and a micro SD card slot. On the top, we have 4 inline shoulder buttons, with L1 and R1 being significantly larger than L2 and R2. And on the bottom, we have dual downward firing speakers, a USB Type-C input that supports both fast charging and OTG external controllers, so you can plug in an external controller and play games like a psychopath, and a 3.5-inch headphone jack. Under the hood, we're running a Rockchip RK3326S chipset with a quad-core Cortex A35 CPU clocked at 1.5 GHz. We have a Mali G31 MP2 GPU clocked at 650 MHz, one power-packed gigabyte of DDR3 RAM, an 1800 mAh battery. For storage, it's microSD card only, there's no internal storage here. And for connectivity, we have none. There's no Wi-Fi or Bluetooth on the GKD Pixel 2, which is extremely disappointing. You have to get an external dongle to use Wi-Fi. But while it doesn't have any connectivity, it does have Rumble, which is cool, I guess. And the whole device is running Linux. Let's talk about how this thing actually feels. First off, the metal finish is quite pleasant to hold, and it feels just generally premium compared to some of the cheaper plastics that usually go into these retro handhelds. The controls on here are a mix of squishy and extremely clicky. The face buttons and D-pad are on the squishier side. The D-pad is kind of a firm squish. The D-pad is decent. I'm not in love with it, but it actually does feel quite tactile. You can see here that it sits quite a bit above the body and it flares out at the top. The ABXY buttons feel like a step above the D-pad in my opinion, which is great news. They have a long travel to them, but they don't feel overly squishy or overly clicky. They find a great balance and they're almost silent. I really like these ABXY buttons. They're also rounded at the edge, so there's not much of that like fatigue that you get from a stiff button such as the Retroid Pocket Mini and Retroid Pocket 5. These ones are very pleasant. The start and select buttons are extremely clicky. Listen to this. Definitely docking some points there. Up top, we have these 4 inline shoulder buttons, and these are also on the clickier side. These shoulder buttons and start and select buttons feel like the 4 horsemen of the noise apocalypse. Like, these are so unnecessarily loud. I don't know how it made it through QC, but I guess when it comes to devices, you know, like this, there's pros and cons. So maybe you might love super loud buttons. I don't know. Sounds like I'm shuffling cards with sand. Anyways, from a feeling perspective, they feel quite tactile, and I surely feel when I'm pressing them down. I also hear it. R1 and L1 feel pretty good. L2 and R2 are a little bit more of a reach, and you kind of have to like shoot the gap over the L1 and R1 here in order to press those. Part of me wishes that they had a little bit of difference in elevation so that it made pressing those easier. You kind of have to like arch your finger over in order to not hit the R1 button. So, you know, sometimes it's easier to just like kind of go from hit it from the back, you feel me? Dap me up. On the side here, we have that power button and the menu button. On the left side, we have the volume rocker. The volume rocker sits mostly flush with the left side while poking out just enough to feel up and down, and there's a little gap in the middle. It's quite nice, and it actually feels like really good. Underneath here, we have that micro SD card slot. Now at the bottom here, it's very interesting. There's 2 speakers that are both downfiring from the same area. So it might lead to an interesting effect where acoustically it could sound like it's more stereo because there is 2 speakers in there. It is technically stereo, but because they're so close together, you might not get that full stereo effect. Either way, we also got a headphone jack, which is great for gaming on the go. And also, speaking of gaming on the go, we got this little lanyard slot down here. You thought you were slick. You thought I wouldn't catch you, but that is a certified lanyard slot. I didn't see a lanyard included, so, unlucky, GG's, I guess. But yeah, cool stuff. We got a little lanyard slot there. I used to have the included lanyard with the Anbernic RG Nano here, and I used that all the time. It was my baby, but I lost it on a flight recently, and I'm very sad. And I cry every night until I fall asleep about it. Hopefully, I'll find a nice little lanyard that I could throw on here and regain my emotional attachment. Now let's talk a little bit about how we got to this point with the GKD Pixel 2. The Pixel 2 is a major iteration over the original Pixel, and there's some big differences between the two. The first difference is immediately apparent, and it's this wider profile that you can see here. It does feel a little bit squished, you know what I mean? Like, it feels like you take one of these types of handhelds and you just squish it down. Now, beyond the wider build, they originally had Game Kiddy Pixel 2, their full legal name, printed underneath the screen in the original model. And they changed that to GKD Pixel 2 here. So it's a little bit more, sleek, minimalist. It's kind of goofy that they, they're stuck with the Game Kiddy name. At least Pal Kitty's like kind of leaning into it with, like Pal Kitty. Anyways, like I mentioned in the intro, the screen is actually twice the resolution of the original GKD Pixel. It's still the same 2.4 inch size, but this time it's 640 by 480 instead of 320 by 240. Now this 480p display at 2.4 inches gives us a pixels per inch ratio of 333. That is huge. That's a big step up over basically most other handhelds, especially the ones that are, 3.5 inches at 480p, such as, the Miyoo Flip, the Anbernic RG35XXSP, and just a lot of other handhelds in this price point. They often have larger displays at 480p. The screen itself looks very crisp and extremely sharp. We have this kind of two-fold bezel here. We have the elevated outer bezel, the black screen bezel, and then the display itself. And it kind of feels like a little bit of a diorama in a way. It's really balanced, surprisingly enough. The actual device, when it's locked, feels squished, right? Like, look at this. It kind of feels squished and a little bit long, but when you actually have it turned on, it feels a little bit more balanced. Now, this is actually an OCA laminated screen, which means that there's a glass shield that's actually laminated on top of the screen, and it has a ton of benefits. The biggest one is durability. OCA laminated screens tend to be more durable when it comes to scuffs, dust, and general wear and tear. They also have less glare and light loss, which results in a more clear image overall. Now, OCA lamination isn't anything new, but it does make micro devices much more pocket friendly, especially when you're cramming a bunch of nuts and bolts in there too. However, this is mostly not advised. Under the hood, it's running a Rockchip RK3326S, which is a huge step up from the original single-core Ingenic X1830 chip in the original Pixel. This processor is also a considerable step above the regular RK3326 chipset that's common in a lot of other handhelds. And the last major upgrade, in my opinion, is the battery. This has a hugely improved 1800 mAh battery compared to the GKD Pixel 1's 1300 mAh battery. That's like a 30 or 40% increase, which should help kind of sustain the battery life, especially when you're playing more demanding games in the Nintendo DS and PSP library. So I ran a very scientific battery life test to see how long the Pixel 2's battery would last in a full throttle scenario. I ran Ocarina of Time for Nintendo 64 at full brightness, and we got about 3 hours and 40 minutes of total battery life, which is phenomenal. For a max performance scenario like Nintendo 64 emulation, to get 3 hours and 40 minutes of battery life on a handheld this size is pretty mind-blowing. The 1800 mAh battery is really pulling its weight, and this carries over to Nintendo DS and PSP emulation as well. You should be looking at around 3.5 to 4 hours for each of those consoles at full brightness. And when it comes to lower end consoles such as, Game Boy Advance, Sega Genesis, you can expect between 4 and 5 hours of battery life, depending on the console that you're emulating and the brightness setting. In terms of charging, it usually hovers around the 10 watt range, which is pretty much exactly what you're gonna get. You're getting 5 volt, 2 amp max, and anything above that just regulates down to 10 watts. The handheld charges at roughly 1% every minute, so a full charge from empty takes about 1.5 hours. Calling it fast charge is a bit of a loophole. What they should say is it's compatible with fast chargers. Usually devices in this price range are limited to your regular USB-A 5-volt 1.5 amp charging. Otherwise, you get the spicy pillow, like we saw in RG35XX SPs. Not a good time, not what you want. You do not want exploding batteries. This is a welcome addition. It's great to see good power management, because if there's one thing that this hobby has taught us, it's that you can't take that for granted. I'm talking to you, Ambernick. Also, something weird that I noticed when charging the Pixel 2 is that it doesn't go to sleep mode when you're charging it. Yeah, the display just kind of dims and then goes to black, but it doesn't actually go to sleep mode until you unplug it. Then it goes to sleep mode. What's up with that? I just want to plug it in and turn the device off. So instead, when I'm charging it at night, I have to just do that. Come on. Now, outside of actually charging the device, these power indicator lights are annoying. They just cut off, so it just looks janky. It is a little bit helpful when it comes to, I guess keeping an eye on charge when you're in game. But when you're playing a game, like, it's not that big of a deal to just press the menu button and then see the battery percentage, like actual battery percentage at the top right. I think this is more inconvenient than just seeing that, It's a cool feature, but it feels kind of like a lateral move at best and an annoying move at worst. So, yeah, I don't know. Besides that, let's power this on and see how this screen looks. Okay, so off the bat, the power on time with the Pixel 2 with original firmware is extremely slow. It took over 30 seconds to power on the GKD Pixel 2. That is not what we want. Pretty slow for a Linux device like this, especially something that's micro-sized that you're gonna be carrying around everywhere. It's supposed to be more pick up and play. I would normally say let's, maybe wait for a firmware update that could maybe speed this up. But when it comes to the stock operating system on here, the Pixel 2 is running a pretty mature version of Rocknix. So there's not much more we can squeeze out of that in terms of the official firmware. When it comes to custom firmware, that's where things could be sped up a lot more. So I'd maybe try out MinUI or another operating system if you're looking for faster power on time. That being said, when it comes to sleep mode and turning it back on from sleep, it's pretty quick, less than a second for each. So that's kind of what you'll probably want to do instead of powering this off and powering it on every time. The stock OS is called iUX, and it is not intuitive. There's no ability to add a recents list. All you have is favorites, and look at how horrible favorites is. When it comes to DS games, it doesn't show the title, it just shows the platform. So if you want to launch any recently played game, you're either gonna have to favorite it or you'll have to scroll and find it by hand. And good luck finding it, because by the way, the ROMs that are included with this SD card are numbered, so they're not in alphabetical order. It's only some of them that are numbered, and then it switches to alphabetical order. I mean, at least we have a search function, but the problem is that you can't search across consoles. And here is the worst part of navigating this operating system. When you're inside of a system folder, B doesn't exit out. You have to use, yep, you guessed it, start. That's right. Start takes you out. And then of course, once you're out of the system, you want to go back to the main menu. So you'd say start again. Nope, that just changes the view. B works now. That's right, you click A to go into your games, and then start to get out of your game console, and then B to take you back to the main menu. Oh yeah, that's real intuitive. iUX is just bad. I would highly recommend not using this front end. And luckily, we actually have an option to not use this front end. The first thing that you should do when you receive your GKD Pixel 2 is go to settings, go to settings again, and change your launcher from iUX to EmulationStation. It'll save you an infinite amount of headaches of having to use this front end here. It's really bad. Unfortunately, the software woes don't end there. You still have to do a fair amount of tinkering inside of EmulationStation to get it the way that you want it to. Luckily, there's a lot of options, but it's kind of a double-edged sword, you know? You have a lot of options to configure how you want to show your different games, and there's also 8 different themes for EmulationStation, and each one is actually pretty cool. My favorites are the Switch Mini 2 here, which makes it kind of look like a Switch menu screen. Pretty sleek and very fun, especially at this tiny little size. It's like a little mini Switch. My favorite is actually Trinitron. Kind of makes it feel like a tiny TV. It really feels nice with this inset screen. So because there's 8 different themes that come included, I'd recommend just scrolling through each one and seeing which one you like. Now, as Tech Dweeb's mother would say, enough dilly-dallying and let's get into some gaming. Let's run some different games on here and talk about how they look, play, and feel, and let's see how much performance we can really squeeze out of this thing. Let's check it out. Quick disclaimer before we get into the gameplay, most of these games come preloaded on the stock SD card that comes with the GKD Pixel 2, but I did add a handful of my own games into the mix, so you'll see a little indicator at the top left for any games that don't come preloaded on the SD card. Anything that doesn't have that indicator comes with the Pixel 2's SD card. Starting off with Super Famicom, aka the Super NES, aka SNES, we're playing Yoshi's Island. It ran pretty good, but it did crash on the first launch, which was kind of weird. After relaunching it, it seemed to work fine. And of course, this handheld passes the F0 test. And that test is basically me getting first place. Anything less is a fail. Anyway, here's me getting beat to shit in Mega Man X. Good times. Moving into Game Boy Color, here we got Croc 2, a certified classic puzzle platformer. The colors and saturation look very crisp, and the simple controls feel pretty great. The emulator default settings have this overlay border on it. It's very subtle, but it balances things out pretty well. And if you're wondering, this is the perfect Pokemon machine. Pokemon Crystal looks so crisp and awesome on this sharp, tiny little screen. It's big enough to see exactly what's going on, and it's very sharp, so text, it looks so crisp, sprites look great, and it's just an amazing pairing, especially with the extra buttons for fast forward and turbo A and B. Honestly, I feel like fast forward is kind of a necessity when replaying these older Pokemon games. Fast forward a generation, here we got Game Boy Advance, and with this we're also introducing the shoulder buttons. Off the jump you can see I have assumed the triangle formation with my index fingers. This is kind of just how I've been playing these games. You can also grip the handheld from the sides a little more and kind of arch your fingers over, but I found that this is just more comfortable for me. Castlevania Aria of Sorrow is so good on here. There's nothing better than replaying these games that have such beautiful artwork on a screen this small with a high resolution. Everything just pops off the screen. The colors, the shading, the detail, everything just looks so crisp here. And that carries into Metroid Zero Mission as well. 2 things about this game really stood out to me. First, the visuals and the saturation here are just on another level, and the display on the Pixel 2 feels like it's in the same category as the Trim UI Brick. The panel here is really giving the Trim UI Brick screen a run for its money, and that screen is absolutely gorgeous. Now, the other thing that stood out to me is the D-pad. It's really not precise, and I think the cracks are starting to show with how unfortunate this D-pad is when it comes to precision-based games. I had a lot of misinputs to where it became a little bit frustrating. I'd be missing jumps, I'd be getting hit because I'm accidentally bumping into enemies, but even throughout all that, it was still fun to play, and I'd certainly play more Metroid on here. Dungeon crawler hack and slashes like Shining Soul 2 are also great, but again, the D-pad is just a little too imprecise to be fully enjoyable. The problem really comes down to diagonal movements with the D-pad and having accidental diagonals when you're trying to move in a straight direction or trying to hit a diagonal and instead moving in a straight direction. So that all kind of falls under the umbrella of just an imprecise D-pad. For a device at this size and price point, there's gonna be some compromises that have to be made, and it seems like the D-pad is one of the bigger compromises that I've noticed. Now, you know what game doesn't need precision? Motherfucking Pokemon Unbound. I've said it once, I'm gonna say it again. This thing is perfect for Pokemon. I was so immersed in Pokemon Unbound There's something about playing Pokemon on a micro handheld like this that's just so addicting. It's built for pick up and play. The turn-based nature, the beautiful saturated art style, everything about Pokemon games is just perfect for the GKD Pixel 2. Now, I've never played Pokemon Unbound before, and it's really been high on my backlog list. And you might have heard about my backlog. But I'm already loving this game. It's so polished and unique. The graphics are awesome, and the mission system is a really welcome addition. I never thought I needed side quests in Pokemon, but they've added a whole new level of depth to this gameplay. So I highly recommend Pokemon Unbound on the Pixel 2. This is very high on the list. Moving on into Nintendo DS, this is where things get a little shaky, per usual when it comes to devices like this that don't have a touchscreen. Out of the gate, Nintendo DS is a compromised experience because you have to figure out how to map touchscreen controls, and on top of that, map all the other controls, such as switching screen, moving your cursor, all of that. Per usual, I found that out the hard way with Tony Hawk's American Skateland. When it came to Diddy Kart DS, same thing. So here's some Mario Kart gameplay. You can see that there is a automatic frame skip actually enabled by default. This helps games run more consistently, and you can actually disable this or enable it per game or for all your games. I left it on for Mario Kart because this is one of those fast-moving games that really requires frame skip to run well on a device that has this level of processor. The controls for Mario Kart DS are also very intuitive, so you don't really need to use those L2 and R2 buttons for anything. Those are really just to switch screens, which you'll never have to do. All that said, Mario Kart is pretty fun on here. Okay, I'm very excited to talk about this now. Animal Crossing Wild World. This has been a standout experience for me. A really, really lovely game. Again, this feels like a perfect match for the GKD Pixel 2. This is a game that doesn't require a whole lot of precision or, fast reaction time. This is pick up and play, and it plays great. I did have the frame skip automatically enabled for the gameplay capture here, but I disabled frame skip after recording and it felt great. So you can probably just disable frame skip for this and get a slightly smoother experience. Now, when I was recording this, I got way too immersed playing, and I ended up spending like 20 minutes just planting flowers and meeting villagers. So I'd call that a good sign for Animal Crossing enjoyers. I think this might be a device that is gonna make you feel right at home. Animal Crossing is extremely charming, and I'm so glad to see that the DS version runs well on the Pixel 2. Jumping over to PSP games, here we have Persona 3. I wish they included this game with the Pixel 2's SD card because this is a phenomenal match for the Pixel 2. The high resolution screen on here makes the text and visuals look so crisp, and it's a very pick up and play game. The turn-based gameplay is really fun too. Everything runs surprisingly well. There's minimal slowdowns or stutters. The only time that I really noticed an occasional frame dip is during transitions into battle. But it's very consistent outside of this, and even within battle, it's pretty solid. We are using automatic frame skip that is enabled by default, but with a processor like this, we kind of got to take what we can get. And for higher end systems, if that means using frame skip to get a more consistent experience, that's just what we got to do. And to be honest, 99% of people won't notice that frame skip is even enabled. Now, speaking of frame skip and performance in general, here is LEGO Star Wars 2, which is far from perfect when it comes to performance, but it's surprisingly playable. And I was actually shocked because this game shouldn't run this well on this RK3326S processor, but it's fairly decent. Even with frame skip enabled, this game has no right playing this well. Now, frame rate floated around 50 to 60 FPS outside of battle and dropped to around 30 FPS when there's a lot of explosions and enemies. This is a pretty demanding title, so getting those kinds of frame rates is very impressive. Kudos to Game Kiddy for pulling that kind of performance out. Jumping over to home consoles, here we got Nintendo 64. Now, before we look at specific games, I want to talk about the N64 experience because this one has a bit of quirks to it. Now, after spending a lot of time playing N64 games on the Pixel 2, I've noticed that these games often stutter a fair bit for the first few minutes. After that, they're surprisingly smooth and consistent. Obviously not perfect, but more than playable and definitely enjoyable. I think that it's something along the lines of shader caching or texture caching that's causing the stutters for the first few minutes, and then once things are cached, then it plays a little smoother. I could be wrong, but that's kind of my hunch. Now let's talk about some specific games. Off the bat, Super Mario 64 plays great. Obviously, N64 is a console designed with an analog stick in mind, and here we only have a D-pad. So you won't be able to get those fine-tuned controls, and for a 3D precision platformer like Super Mario 64, you might be missing that kind of tiptoe walking. With a D-pad, it's all or nothing. So with that said, you might want to consider playing the DS version instead, since it's designed with the D-pad in mind. In the 64 version, I found myself falling off stuff a lot because of the imprecise D-pad combined with the D-pad instead of an analog stick, so bit of a compromise experience, but also pretty enjoyable. Paper Mario, on the other hand, was very surprising. I have been having so much fun playing this. This is one of those games that I've kept playing a lot more of after capturing this gameplay. It runs almost full speed most of the time, but there's a little bit of audio crackling and some occasional slowdown, so it might require some emulation settings tweaks to improve that. Outside of performance, it looks crisp and it's extremely enjoyable overall. So if you're not a stickler for full speed all the time and you don't mind like 98%, then this is going to be a super fun game to play. I'd also recommend remapping some controls to make it a more smooth experience. And I'll probably make a separate video about setting up the GKD Pixel 2 and what kind of control schemes work best for the different consoles. But with all that said, Paper Mario is lovely, so I can definitely recommend playing this one on the Pixel 2. Now, last and far from least, we have Ocarina of Time. It actually blew my mind being able to play this on a micro pocket-sized handheld here, especially being able to play it at a consistent and enjoyable frame rate. I spent a lot of time remapping the controls to find the kind of perfect control scheme to make this one work, because you have to constantly access your C buttons, your shield, your sword, and roll. There's a lot of controls that go into this, but I think I found the sweet spot. And my custom proprietary control scheme is actually surprisingly intuitive once you get the hang of it. Outside of the occasional stutters during combat and scene changes, this game is very, very enjoyable. And I'd say this is pretty high on the recommendations, especially because it comes included with the preloaded SD card. Moving on into Dreamcast, here we have Rayman 2. On the Pixel 2, it plays at a smooth 60 FPS locked. Apparently the PS1 version is a stripped down remake, so Dreamcast is an entirely different game. Controls are snappy, the visuals are the visuals, and the L2 targeting kinda sucks, but I remapped controls and after that it felt pretty solid. Speaking of PS1, here we have Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. This plays exactly how you expect it. Overall, it's pretty solid. I didn't notice any major performance problems. I know there's gonna be people who are gonna tell me to play the Dreamcast version instead, but I needed to test some PS1 games, and Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 is my go-to for PS1. My other go-to for PS1 is Crash 3 Warped. Crash 3 is one of those games that surprisingly needs a good D-pad to play it well. So it's often been a pretty clear indicator of whether a D-pad is good or bad. And I can tell you straight up, it's bad. Not as bad as the Anbernic RG34XX, which is that Game Boy Advance clone. If you want to see a review on that one, I'll have a link in the top corner. He's flopping around a little less on the Pixel 2, but it still wasn't a great experience playing Crash 3 on here. Now, the third game I didn't actually put on my list of games to test. I just impulsively launched Capcom vs. SNK for the PS1. I've never been a fighting game head, so this was completely foreign, but I have absorbed the ancient forbidden knowledge of how to Hadouken from Retro Game Core, so I gave it the old Hadoukenable test, and I can tell you it's Hadoukenable and maybe Shoryukenable. I did one uppercut Shoryuken move, and I wasn't able to do it again, and I also didn't know the inputs for it. Take that for a grain of salt. Performance-wise, the game runs great. You can expect a full speed, very pleasant experience. outside of the, D-pad. Now, I might have mentioned earlier, but the GKD Pixel 2 runs Rocknix, so we have Portmaster support. This opens up a world of ports of so many different games, and a couple of them are included, one of them being Celeste. Now, talking about the gameplay experience, my hands got a little crampy while playing this, but it was still very fun. Going back to the whole D-pad problem, this was probably the worst that the D-pad felt for me outside of Metroid Zero Mission and Super Mario 64. But the face buttons were actually pretty nice, and the shoulder buttons weren't too bad either. Unfortunately, Stardew Valley, which was included with the Pixel 2, did not run. It didn't launch. You could always buy the game and try installing the Portmaster files yourself. Another fantastic port that should have been included with the Pixel 2 is Cave Story. This is a game that I haven't played in 15 years, and it is so good. This one definitely brings back nostalgic memories. It plays very crisp and it looks beautiful on the Pixel 2. The very simple and sharp tile-based artwork looks very good, and everything just kind of pops here. It's a simple game, but one of those classic Metroidvanias that's certainly worth checking out, especially because it's freeware. So if you have access to a USB Wi-Fi dongle, then you can plug that into your Pixel 2, launch Portmaster, and download Cave Story directly to your handheld. So as we saw, performance on the GKD Pixel 2 is very impressive. It's not the most performant thing at its price point, but for the size, this thing has some serious horsepower. For a device that's literally the size of my palm, it's really cool that we're able to run everything from Dreamcast, N64, although not perfectly, DS, PSP, the list goes on. This thing is the perfect pocket companion, especially being able to run all of those consoles, and we get ports too. This thing is just awesome. It looks great, it feels great for the most part. I had to do some controller remapping depending on the games, especially these L2 and R2 triggers. But when everything's said and done, gaming on here was quite an impressive and very enjoyable experience. Out of the box, the emulators that are included on the Pixel 2 are pre-configured quite well, with good performance and control layouts, nice overlays, everything just feels good. I had to tweak some controls on Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, but it was well worth the effort. Those games use analog sticks and plenty of different buttons, especially the Nintendo 64. It kind of comes with the territory of a D-pad only device like this. Now you're probably wondering, how comfortable is the Pixel 2? Well, it's complicated. For 3D platformers like Rayman 2, having to use these tiny L2 and R2 buttons back there for, C targeting, it kind of gets pretty crampy. You might have to play like this. I don't know if that's exactly how you want to relive your memories of that game. 2D titles like Castlevania, Metroid, Celeste, those are a bit more comfortable because you don't need to use those tiny L2 and R2 shoulder buttons back there. You'll need to use the regular ones. That being said, you do have to hold it in a little bit of a stretchy way, so your hands might get a little bit crampy. Honestly, the best games that are the most comfortable on here are ones that don't even touch these shoulder bumpers up there. But it's certainly not a bad experience to play those kinds of games. Quite the opposite, it's actually quite fun, just it does get a little crampy. Now where this handheld really shines is with non-precision games like RPGs, adventure titles, visual novels, etc. Pretty much anything that doesn't require precise movements or a whole lot of up here. When it comes to overall heat, the device gets a little bit warm when playing systems like N64, Dreamcast, kind of the more demanding titles, but it's far from uncomfortable. I'd put it at slightly hotter than the warmth of anything else when you kind of hold it for like a little too long and it feels warm. Crank that up a little bit and that's about as hot as this gets, until you plug it in to charge it. When you plug it in to charge it, it gets noticeably hotter, to the point where I'd consider it pretty uncomfortable. This is likely a combination of the metal housing with the fast charging support, but I just don't like charging it and playing it at the same time because the heat gets a little too much for my sensitive mitts. Moving on to this display, I love this little display. It's really sharp and bright, and the max brightness output is just absolutely stunning. It's definitely a device that you can bring outside and play outdoors. This display is easily one of the best IPS panels I've seen on a device this size. The saturation and contrast here is great. It's not an OLED, so you're not gonna get those hyper-saturated colors and deep contrast, but more than enough for a handheld in this category. The screen is definitely a standout feature. Now, speaking of standout, the GKD Pixel 2 logo underneath the screen definitely stands out, especially when you're playing GBA games and you have that Game Boy Advance logo, and then underneath that you have the GKD Pixel 2 logo, and underneath that you have the GKD logo. Man, it's just too many stacked logos, and even up top you have the Nintendo logo. I honestly just disable the screen overlay because I can't disable those two logos down there. So yeah, definitely not my favorite device branding by a long shot. I think I gotta give that one to Trim UI. We have a Trim UI logo on the D-pad, and above that we have another Trim UI logo, and we have a Trim UI logo button at the bottom, and on the right side we have a Trim UI logo, and on the back we have a Trim UI logo, and just to be safe we threw one more Trim UI logo indented at the bottom just in case anything happens. Moving on to sound, the speakers don't necessarily get very loud. I wouldn't call them quiet, but they're not very loud. I'd say like 2 or 3 volume bumps quieter than I'd want it to be at max volume. It also tends to get a little bit crunchy when it's at those max volumes. Here's a speaker test compared to the Anbernic RG35XX SP to get a feel for how the Pixel 2 sounds. The face buttons are nice and tactile, but still have plenty of travel for very satisfying presses. But there's one weird thing that I'm noticing. It's this micro friction that happens whenever my thumb slides across the buttons. And it only happens on these buttons. It doesn't happen anywhere else, not even the D-pad. Not any other buttons. I checked 18 other devices and I have not had this problem on anything else. Check this out. I just don't know what's causing it. I think it's the materials that they chose. I don't know, it feels weird on my thumb. It's very subtle, but once you notice it, you can't unnotice it. And I only feel it really when my thumb changes buttons. A little bit bothersome, but not the end of the world. When it comes to connectivity, I'm really missing Wi-Fi and Bluetooth on here. But I also understand that it might just be the limitations of a metal body and how it interferes with signals. So we know that when it comes to connectivity, the Pixel 2 is kind of living on an island. It doesn't have Bluetooth and it doesn't have Wi-Fi built in. This is essentially a Faraday cage of sorts, but what it does have is a Type-C port. So we can plug a dongle into this port and basically give it temporary Bluetooth or Wi-Fi support. Only specific USB Wi-Fi dongles actually work with the GKD Pixel. So I'll leave the one that I'm using here linked in the description below. So what does having Wi-Fi let us do? Well, a few things. First, we can actually launch Portmaster and download any ready-to-run port directly to the device here and launch it straight on the device without even having to touch a computer. If you want to browse the commercial ports too, it can save you a few steps on the computer. You just have to actually download the original commercial game files on the computer and then transfer them over. Portmaster is just so goated, so I'd really recommend checking it out using either a Wi-Fi adapter or going on your computer and downloading the ports there, then transferring them over. Another thing that having Wi-Fi lets us do is run Splore. The problem is I don't have a valid Pico 8 license, but it is possible. And one last thing that we can actually do is, if we really want to, we can game stream on Moonlight. I'm not gonna go down that rabbit hole again. I played Skyrim as a meme using the Trim UI brick. Practically unplayable, but it did run using Moonlight. And if you're a die-hard retro achievements addict, you can also keep this Wi-Fi dongle plugged in and connect to your retro achievements. By the way, you can actually see right below retro achievements, I totally missed this. This has NetPlay support. So you can use NetPlay to play games online with friends, either locally or over the interweb. So that's pretty cool. The Wi-Fi dongle unlocks NetPlay as well. One thing that is a little disappointing is that when it comes to scraping box art, we're limited to only the ArcadeDB database. So you'll have to scrape all your box art for every other system using your computer, and we're back to the Stone Age on that one. Anyways, that's the Wi-Fi dongle experience. When it came to Bluetooth, my Bluetooth test was unsuccessful. I had a Bluetooth 4.0 dongle that I just scrounged up from the depths of my computer drawer, and I couldn't get it to work. But I almost got an 8BitDo Ultimate controller to work. It connected, and then it would immediately disconnect. Well, we're 1 for 3, but at least we got Wi-Fi so we can access Portmaster, Pico Explorer potentially, and retro achievements if you're a diehard Chivo fan. But, at least we have a Type-C and headphone jack. Now I want to take a step back from all the technical, nitty gritty of a device like this and talk a little bit about my personal thoughts on the Pixel 2 as a whole. If you're like me, you see a small premium looking handheld and think, finally, this will solve all my problems and I can bring it anywhere and game on the go. And in reality, that might be true. But I'd also encourage you to ask yourself 2 questions. Will I use a micro handheld like the Pixel 2 more than a larger one like the TrimUI Brick or Anbernic SP? And are you happy sacrificing some of those ergonomics and comfort for a more micro pocketable experience like this? If the answer to both of those is yes, then the GKD Pixel 2 would be a great fit for you. But if the answer to only one of those is yes, then I'd consider other devices like the TrimUI Brick or the Anbernic RG353M as alternatives to the Pixel 2. So let's talk value. The Pixel 2 retails for $80 US. And for that price, you get performance up through PS1 and Nintendo DS, and then some N64, Dreamcast, and PSP games with some compromises. The screen is extremely good and the controls are solid. Face buttons and D-pad are good. Bumpers are not great. The ergonomics aren't perfect and they definitely cut a few corners when it came to audio and the battery life, along with some weird software bugs. But overall, this is a really solid price point. They strike a great balance of size, performance, price, and quality that I think makes this a very compelling device for anyone interested in micro handhelds. The GKD Pixel 2 is a device that gets better with time. Every minute that I spend with it, I like it that much more. Gameboy Color is right at home. GBA is spectacular. D-pad only DS games are excellent, and N64 runs just good enough to feel like I kind of have a micro N64 player in my pocket. And on top of that, we have all of the other consoles crammed in this tiny metal box. It's just such a cute, fun experience. It really does feel like I'm playing on a little diorama. I've just been enjoying every second that I spend with the Pixel 2. This is a lovely and charming little device. I can definitely recommend this to anybody looking for a micro console that has a little more kick to it than your ordinary micro consoles. So that's the Game Kiddy Pixel 2. I know your full name, Buster. I love this micro handheld. It really stands out as one of the more premium experiences you can get at this size and price. It's not perfect, but it is, as a whole package, such a lovely and enjoyable experience. This is one of those devices that when I'm playing certain games, I really get immersed and I just lose track of time. That's a great sign for a micro handheld. It's really hard to find immersive experiences at this size, and GKD does it very well. Overall, the Pixel 2 is a great micro handheld, so if you're looking to pick one of these up, I'll have an affiliate link in the description below. I'd highly recommend checking this out if you're interested in micro handhelds. If you enjoyed the video, drop me a like and leave a comment of what you think of the GKD Pixel 2 and what games you'd want to play on a handheld like this. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. And if you subscribed, thanks for subscribing. I'm Monto Tech, and I'm also out of here. Later! If you like this review, you might be interested in my video about 5 games I've been playing from my backlog. I played all of them on my purple Trim UI brick with the lit NXT Crossmix SD card. Man, that's a mouthful, but the games sure aren't. There's only 5 of them with a little bonus at the end. Check out that video here.